Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's Civic Conversations. Let everybody start coming in. We're so excited that you're here. My name is Rachel Davison Humphries. I'm Director of Outreach at the Bill of Rights Institute, and this is the final in our summer series for Civic Conversations, where we were looking at hot topics in teaching, race, religion, and politics. And I cannot tell you how excited I am to have our guest here today, Dr. Wayne Journell. Dr. Journell is Professor of Social Studies Education and Associate Chair at the Department of Teacher Education and Higher Education at University of North Carolina at Greensboro. So not only is he now have this lauded academic position, but he was also a high school social studies teacher. So Dr. Journell received his undergraduate degree and teacher licensure at James Madison University, very near and dear to our hearts here at BRI. He then received a master's degree in curriculum instruction from Virginia Tech and a PhD in secondary social studies education from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Since then, he's taught at UNCG, where he also coordinates the secondary teacher education program. Dr. Journell's primary focus, and this is why we invited him on to this episode of Civic Conversations, is the teaching of politics and controversial issues in secondary education, with secondary interests in teaching social studies with technology and via inquiry. So Dr. Journell's received a ton of different awards. He was the two-time recipient of Exemplary Research in Social Studies, NCSS Award. He's also the current editor of Theory and Research in Social Education, and an editor for the Research and Practice Social Studies book series at Teachers College Press. So if you go and you look at Dr. Journell's Google Scholar, you can see that he has been in an absolute flurry of research and writing over the past 5 years, as you can imagine. And I want to specifically recommend that you check out 3 books that he has published within the past couple of years. The first is a journal or a collection he edited called Teaching Social Studies in an Era of Divisiveness, the Challenges of Discussing Social Issues in a Nonpartisan Way. Seems very relevant. Then he actually literally wrote the book, Teaching Politics in Secondary Education, Engaging in Contentious Issues, which is why we have him on this episode today. And his most recent book is also a must-have. It's called Unpacking Fake News, An Educator's Guide to Navigating the Media with Students. I am so very, very excited to welcome Dr. Wayne Journell to the Bill of Rights Institute Civic Conversations. Hello, Dr. Journell.
Hello, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, it is definitely going to be energetic, I am sure. I can see that we have, close to 40 participants already in this webinar live. If you're viewing us on YouTube later on, just type your comments in the chat. We'll still be monitoring and making sure that this conversation continues because it is so relevant and important. For those of you on our Zoom webinar, if you have any questions as we're going through the conversation today, feel free to drop those in the Q&A button down at the bottom, or if you just want to put them in the chat, we have some colleagues monitoring the chat and I'll keep an eye on it as well. But because BRI is a teacher-centered, teacher-focused organization, we really want this to be a conversation. We've invited Dr. Journell here to engage with you, the educator who needs the support in this area. So please don't be scared about joining us. I can see we have a lot of middle school people, so that's awesome because I also taught middle school for almost 9 years. But we also have a ton of high school educators as well. So Dr. Journell, thank you so much for being here. I just wanted to start with tell me a little bit about your own educational journey. What drew you, and universities people, hi Jennifer. What drew you to education? What was your own educational journey?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Roanoke, Virginia, and I come from a family of educators. My dad was a teacher and eventually a principal, and then he ended his career as a district superintendent or associate superintendent. And I had aunts and uncles in the teaching profession. So it's, like probably many of the people on this call, is kind of in the blood a little bit. So then I made the decision to go to James Madison, as you said, and I started out as a history major, but I had a great advisor. Her name is Dr. Barbara Stern. And one day I remember going into her office and saying, I wanted to be a teacher. And she goes, well, you're a history major? And I said, Yes. She goes, well, do you want to eat? And I said, well, I generally, yes. She goes, well, you need to change your major to interdisciplinary social sciences because, if you're just a history major, they can only hire you to teach history, at least in Virginia at the time. And so I changed my major and actually got hired during my student teaching. I was actually teaching 3 sections of world geography, and the world history teacher there had to have emergency back surgery. So I guess either they were desperate or I was doing a pretty good job because the principal came to me and said, well, we'd like you to take over, and literally the next day, and the world history teacher basically said, we're at the Napoleonic Wars and you got to get to present day, have fun. And anyways, in hindsight, I always tell my student teachers it was the best thing that ever happened to me because it kind of forced me to, get my feet to the fire really quick. But then I went back to Roanoke, Virginia after I graduated and taught in a school in Roanoke County, a high school in Roanoke County for 5 years. And like I said, during that time, I got my master's degree at Virginia Tech. And, it was a bittersweet decision to leave the classroom. I know a lot of people think that people in higher ed either couldn't hack it in the K-12 schools or, didn't like teaching high school. That definitely was not the case for me. I really enjoyed my time teaching high school, but personally, I had started dating the person who's now my wife, and she's a veterinarian. And if you know anything about the vet school, number of vet schools in the country, there's only about 25, 26 vet schools in the country. And so she applied at Virginia Tech, which would have been very convenient, but she didn't get in. And so the only other place she applied was the University of Illinois. So at that time, I was like, we did the long distance thing for about 4 years, and it was about put up or shut up time. And so I started looking for jobs, teaching jobs, K-12 teaching jobs in Illinois. But that was right about the time the Great Recession was, starting to hit, and it wasn't very good with the job market. So I had kind of thought down the line, I wanted to, train future teachers. So I started exploring options there. And it turned out that the University of Illinois had a fellowship just for people wanting to get a PhD in social studies education. So my entire doctorate was paid for. So, they kind of made me an offer I couldn't refuse. So it was a bittersweet, decision to leave the high school classroom at that point. But I really enjoy what I'm doing now because here at UNCG, we get to teach, we get to research. And, I like to think that my influence goes out to the pre-service teachers who then go out, get jobs. And, I'm spreading my influence farther than what I was when I was just teaching high school.
Absolutely. Well, that's quite the journey. And it sounds like you really found your niche. You kind of had all this background to bring with you. And then, this opportunity to enter the field at the higher ed level really presented itself. What got you into this teaching politics kind of space? There's a lot of kind of focuses you can have, foci you can have within the social studies space. What is it specifically that inspired you about helping teachers teach politics?
Well, like most scholars, I can draw a direct line back to my own teaching experiences. So when I was teaching high school, the main things that I taught were U.S. history and civics and government. And so in my teacher education program, JMU had a great program, but it was very history centric. I mean, we talked about how to teach history. And I remember when I started teaching, government, it's almost impossible to teach a government class without engaging in, conversations about, politics and contentious issues. And I realized I didn't have a framework to do that. I had never been taught, so I kind of did it my way. And, and, knowing what I know now, at the time, I did a lot of things that I thought were right. And, some of the stuff that we'll talk about today, I was doing it even before I knew what I was, the specific terms for it. But then there were other things that I could have improved upon. So when I went to Illinois and, when you get a PhD, a lot of people go into their PhD programs thinking, I want to train future teachers. Well, a PhD is not a teaching degree. It's a research degree. So it's like, okay, now what do I want to research? And immediately I was like, I know there's other teachers out there who have the similar issue that I did. They're teaching civics, government, U.S. history, and these contentious issues are coming up. And, we need to know more about how to do that well. And my dissertation was actually on the 2008 presidential election. And believe it or not, you would think in social studies, because, presidential elections are those quintessential moments, in social studies, where, the theory and the practice come together, that there should have been a lot of research on how to teach presidential elections, and there really wasn't. And so, I was able to do kind of, turned out, I like to think it was a good study of 6 teachers across 3 schools and how they taught the presidential election. And of course, I got a little bit lucky with the 2008 election because it was the first African-American candidate and only the second woman vice presidential candidate. So there's a lot of layers of data that came out of it. But and so since then, that's kind of led my research trajectory. I did a study of the 2012 election, and then in between other studies of good practices in civics and government.
That's awesome. And it's like I said, you kind of came in, there's been a lot of, not luck, but just being in the right place at the right time when it comes to the teaching of politics in secondary education in the US. And so if you look through your research, this term keeps coming up, this idea that you advocate. And the term is, and the way that you talk about the kind of best practices around teaching politics is an idea called committed impartiality. I was fascinated because again, I'm someone in the field. I was in the classroom for 9 years and I hadn't heard this advocated for before. I'm still not sure. I'm still not sure how it would work. Right. And so I would love for you to take a few minutes and explain to everyone on the call today, what is the idea of committed impartiality and how does it support teaching politics?
Sure. So I want to be upfront that I did not come up with this term, right? So this term's actually pretty old. A scholar named Thomas Kelly came up with this in 1986 in an article, as a theoretical article about how to the teacher's 4 perspectives on the teacher's role. And so going back to what we just talked about, when I was teaching government, I was engaging in committed impartiality before I even knew what it was, right? And so when I got to my PhD program, I found this article and it kind of spoke to me. So let's talk about committed impartiality by first talking about what it's not. So in that article, Thomas Kelly talks about 4 perspectives on the way that teachers can engage students in discussions of controversial issues and what their role is. And so I'll go over the first 3, which he kind of argues are not, ideal. And then I'll come back to committed impartiality. So the first one is exclusive neutrality. And with exclusive neutrality, that basically means teachers say, whoa, I'm not touching a controversial issue at all, right? And unfortunately, a lot of times teachers do that, right? Diana Hess is another big name researcher in this field.
Yeah.
And she calls that avoidance. And
so let me clarify there, because exclusive, like just the term exclusive neutrality could be that you are exclusively neutral, but that's not how you're using that phrase. That phrase means that you exclude so that you remain neutral.
Yeah, great.
Okay.
Great point, clarification. Basically, you're not even giving yourself the chance not to be neutral because you're not, like, you're not touching with a 10-foot pole. And of course, we were talking a little bit before we got on air. That's not the civic, model for teaching, right? If we think about civic education in the Deweyan sense as classrooms as laboratories of democracy, where else are students going to learn to have these conversations if we don't have them in classrooms? So this exclusive neutrality is no good. On the opposite side of that would be exclusive partiality. This is what most people think about when you think of the term indoctrination, okay? So exclusive partiality would be, this is what I believe, and you have to believe it too, right? And if you don't believe it, I'm going to dock your grade, right? And I think we can all agree that's no good, right? We want to stay away from that. The next one is the one that seems appealing, and it's called neutral impartiality. And it's where teachers say, all right, we're going to have, we're going to allow for discussions of controversial issues. But in that role of engaging with controversial issues, the teacher just says, I can't tell you what I believe, right? And so, unfortunately, a lot of times educators fall into that by default because of what they've seen in the media, and we can talk about that more in a little bit, about teachers being fired for delivering their political views. And again, we were talking about this a little bit before air. It's not usually, but the reason why teachers get fired is not because they're talking about politics or even disclosing their opinion. It's how they're doing it. They're getting into yelling matches with students, or they engage in profanity-laced, tirades about a certain candidate or something like that. That's not neutral impartiality. That's more along the lines of exclusive partiality, and that should be something that's disciplined, right? And then, in that article, Kelly really makes a good point about, you know, there's an inherent danger with neutral impartiality, because it assumes that classrooms can be neutral. And there is no such thing as a neutral classroom. You can try. And there's a lot of teachers out there who, you know, give it the good old college try and they swear they're being neutral. Well, my research suggests that they're not, right? And it's not because they're bad teachers, it's because they're exceedingly human. You know, teachers, we would hope that our social studies teachers have strong political beliefs. They vote and they follow the news and everything, because if they're not, you know, that's a problem. And so, you know, it's, even if you don't come out and voice, you know, what your, and come out and really say, you know, what you believe, it's what Diana Hess and Paula McAvoy call it, seepage. It's going to seep out, right? So in my research, I've sat through many, sat in the back of many classrooms of teachers who think that they're being neutral, but I'm sitting in the back writing down all the partisan things that they're saying and doing, right? And they're doing it subconsciously because, again, they're human. So Thomas Kelly says the better route to go is what's called committed impartiality. And committed impartiality basically says, in the context of discussing controversial issues, it is perfectly fine for the teacher to say, well, this is where I stand on it, but that doesn't make me right, right? When we're talking about controversial issues, open controversial issues, where there are multiple valid viewpoints on both sides of the issue, or multiple sides of the issue, my opinion is not any better than your opinion. And, you know, teachers who do this well will usually say, you know, something along the lines, well, this is what I believe. Well, what do you believe? Let's talk about it, right? And there are multiple benefits, pedagogical benefits to doing this. You know, everybody's worried about indoctrination, right? And that's where, you know, it's really easy to look at those teachers who are exclusive partiality teachers and say, that's indoctrination, right? And I agree. The problem is that, you know, a lot of teachers who think that they're being neutral, I would actually argue, are inadvertently indoctrinating their students more than teachers who are doing the committed impartiality approach, because the committed impartiality approach provides context, right? The way I liken it to someone who is media savvy, right? You turn on Fox News, you turn on MSNBC, you pretty much know what angle they're coming from, right? And so when you watch a news segment on Fox News or MSNBC, you take it with a grain of salt, because you know they're coming from either a conservative or a liberal angle. When the students know where their teacher is coming from, they can kind of, it allows them to better, you know, separate facts from the teacher's opinions. When students don't know where their teachers are coming from, or they make guesses which are often wrong, when I've done in my research, when I've interviewed when I've interviewed students, they have a hard time distinguishing between facts and the teacher's opinion. And so a lot of times those seepage opinions that teachers give come across as facts.
Interesting. So let me interject there, because
sure.
I think that's at the crux.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really glad you're here. You've literally written the book. This is important for us to talk about, because the way that I, as many teachers do, is, you know, we were committed to that neutral impartiality. Like, students will never know my opinion. They'll actually think it's wrong all the time. And if they want to know my opinion, I am happy to model, like the way that I did it in my classroom was, I was happy to have those conversations. They just wouldn't happen during the unit, and they wouldn't happen during class time. So if a student wanted to have those conversations, I think it is important that I was a model of conviction, right? Like, as an adult in their environment, I model conviction. That's important. They have to know that I have opinions, but I wanted the classroom to be a space where my opinion wasn't the arbiter, right? I have them. Yes, I would tell my students, I went and campaigned. I'm not going to talk about who I campaigned for, right? Unless the unit's over and it's not on school time. So in my almost 10 years of teaching, I think it happened twice that students would come like that because they actually cared, as opposed to just like having it be a distraction from other things. So, but what I hear you saying is that most teachers, when they're attempting neutral impartiality, they're actually giving signals of their opinion no matter what.
Yes.
It's giving signals with the choices that they're making, the words they're using. Students are gleaning those opinions, but because they're not explicit, they're having a tough time disaggregating what's opinion and what's fact and what the teacher is presenting.
Mhm.
When you take a committed partiality,
Committed impartiality.
committed impartiality, that's
I know
it, committed
the terms aren't the
impartiality.
easiest
And
ones
the terms are not
yeah,
easy.
yeah.
I've written notes, but I couldn't read my own handwriting. The committed impartiality, you're saying that you're committed, you have a committed opinion, but you make the environment impartial.
Yes, correct.
As opposed to you having a neutral opinion and trying to make the environment impartial, but failing.
Yes. And so on a couple of points there, there's nothing, committed impartiality doesn't really come out and say when you disclose, right? So like if you want to, you don't have to necessarily, a teacher doesn't have to necessarily walk in on the first day of class and say, I'm liberal and I voted for X, or I'm conservative, I voted for X. You can have these discussions because sometimes, you want to play the devil's advocate and, that sort of thing. But within the context of a discussion, it's okay for teachers to kind of say, well, this is where I believe in this. And then here's the kicker. Why? Right.
Well, and actually,
Yeah.
Jennifer in our comments just said we can also model how we came to our opinions
100%.
using evidence and facts.
And that's the last point, and to me, the most convincing point of Kelly's argument is, a committed impartiality approach allows teachers to model not just their opinions, but also civic reasoning, how they got to those opinions, but also model civic discourse, which is exceedingly important today because where else are students getting it, right? They might be getting it at their family dinner table, maybe. I mean, if they're lucky, that if families still sit around at the dinner table these days, and not looking at their phones, they're not getting it from the news. Most I always say that we should be the most educated, aware society in history because 70 years ago it was just Walter Cronkite on the news, and that's where everybody got their opinion. But now we have all these news outlets, but we don't corroborate news, right? We watch the ones that tend to align with our preconceived notions. But especially on cable news, you're not getting tolerant civil discourse there. Probably not getting in their circle of friends. Maybe getting in their places of worship, but research suggests maybe not always. And they're certainly not getting it on social media, and increasingly they're not getting it from the politicians themselves. So where else can we model this idea of tolerant political discourse if we're not doing it in schools? And if students are coming in to the classrooms, armed with social media and cable news and the like, it allows the teacher to say, this is how you do it. This is how you can say, because it's an unnatural act to let someone know, well, this is what I believe, but I want to hear your side. That's an unnatural thing. People like to be right. People like to think that they're always right. But a committed impartiality approach where you can model to tell students, even though that we might not agree, let's hear each other out.
Absolutely. And I think that I had honestly, before talking to you, had a little bit misunderstood what committed impartiality meant, right? Even reading everything I've read from you, the committed part comes from having conviction. Right? Like being a model. And again, we think about, I was on a call earlier today where the Tinker case came up, and the idea that schools are the nurseries of democracy, right? Like that's the phrase that the justices used in the Tinker Des Moines student free speech case. And so this nursery of democracy, like I have a 1-year-old daughter, right? We have to create environments where they can practice all the things they're going to need to be able to do, right? We can't expect, if we never let them fall down or bump their head, that they're going to learn to walk, right? Or they're going to learn to run, or they're going to learn to fly airplanes, right? Like we have to give them nurseries. We have to give them spaces where they're protected a little bit, but able to explore the limits of their own understanding. And when you say committed impartiality, the environment remains impartial, so the conversations can happen, but you are a person that demonstrates conviction and models what it means to be an adult committed to ideals.
Yeah, and all the research shows that students appreciate that, right? The teachers are scared as all get out to do it, But the research shows that students like knowing where their teachers stand, as long as they believe that their teachers aren't forcing them to believe the same things they do. And they appreciate their social studies teachers in particular, saying, yeah, I mean, they're social studies teachers. Social studies teacher that doesn't have conviction is like a reading teacher who can't read. It doesn't work, right?
Why would you do it, right?
Exactly, yeah.
There's a reason that we enter the field.
Mhm.
I always talk about there's a reason that you become a middle school or a high school teacher. It like fits your personality.
Right.
The subject area fits your interests, right? Like there's a reason that you're a science teacher or a social studies teacher or a math teacher. And so I think this is a really important conversation, and giving teachers this idea of the committed impartiality, I think is again, you and I went through all of our careers never having been introduced to these ideas, and making sure that people are showcasing what the best pedagogical practices are and frameworks to understand them. That even if you're attempting neutral impartiality, you aren't actually neutral. It's very unlikely that you just don't care. You wouldn't be doing the research to figure out how to be a better teacher about politics if you just didn't care. So there's that dynamic as well. But that this idea of committed impartiality gives you the opportunity to be a model within a democratic self-governing society while still creating an impartial environment.
Yeah.
So given that, this is a good framework. This is an important way for us to assess and reflect on our own practices. But even touching this stuff right now is really hard for educators. I mean, any type of political disclosure. There's a woman in the chat who explained that she was fired immediately after January 7th because she just had a discussion with her kids about what happened at the Capitol. And there's a lot of backlash. There's politics. Civic engagement itself is now a hot button issue, where educators who really just want their kids to be engaged are under not just a microscope, but like a what's the thing where you fry ants? What's that called? Like magnifying glass. Like it's not a microscope. It's not that innocuous. It's a magnifying glass. And so the teachers are under a magnifying glass. So I think best case to ideal world, you can be committed and impartial in the environment. But you're in this space, you and I were talking about this in the earlier, but what are your thoughts or suggestions for your pre-service teachers who are entering environments where even the idea of being committed to something is being called into question?
Yeah, and that's a great point, because I'll just come out and say that, one of the reasons why teachers fall into that exclusive neutrality thing is because anytime you engage in something controversial, it is risky, right? I'm not going to sit here and say that there's no risk involved at all. That said, I think a lot of people are misinformed, and one of the things as a field, as social studies education, that we need to do better is every time I have a conversation like this, I get asked to speak on a decent regular basis to groups like this, and it's usually to teachers. I don't know if we have any administrators on this call or not, and hopefully they'll watch the YouTube if they don't. But most administrators aren't social studies teachers, aren't former social studies teachers, right? And so if you're a math teacher, you don't understand the importance of being able to do this. So I think as a field, we need to bridge that gap between the school administration, district administration, and let them know why this is important for teachers to be able to do. Now, for individual teachers like my pre-service teachers, I think it's important to have conversations with your administrators on your own and let them know why this is important and how you're going to be doing it. Because unfortunately, a lot of times teachers come into this idea of, well, we're just going to debate something, right? Well, I always tell my pre-service teachers, debate is a dirty word, right? I always get soap out, wash that word from your vocabulary, because a debate, if you watch Trump and Biden on the stage, they weren't trying to listen to each other, and debates are about winning, right? And when we frame things in our classroom about winning and losing and different sides, then you got problems. But if you come in saying, we're going to discuss these controversial issues because we want to better understand certain things. Now, the person that you talked about got fired after January 6th, that's one, extremely unfortunate. I'm sorry that happened. But there are some things that, you know, make this difficult because there are some things that don't have a both sides of them to them with them, right? You know, to use a history example, you know, if someone came in to one of your classrooms, and if you teach in the South long enough, this will happen, right? Someone says, well, slavery wasn't that bad. That's not something where you say, well, that's interesting, let's teach a controversy. No, it was bad, right? You know, and we don't have those, we don't allow those things to happen. So that's where you get into like Diana Hess's research on open versus settled issues. And I've kind of talked about that in my research as well. I would argue that January 6th was one of those things too, that, you know, I don't care who you voted for or whatnot, storming the Capitol to try to stop the democratic process is not good, right? And there's really no way to defend that. And, you know, and if someone was fired for stating that fact, I would argue that's problematic, right? That said, you know, we do live in the real world, and, you know, there's districts and, you know, rules and stuff. So, I mean, you know, we're bound by the rules that we live in. But I do think as a field, one of the problems is that we need to bridge that gap between administrators and teachers and what good social studies teaching is. It's not memorizing dates and facts and knowing, you know, that Congress can override a veto with two-thirds of a vote, right? You know, understanding, you know, the issues of the day are important if we're going to, you know, prepare, just like you were arguing with that nursery analogy, right? We can't throw students out at the age of 18 and expect them to be productive citizens if we don't, you know, culture that throughout their
give them some soil and give them some soil and some room and see what happens, right? Like, and I actually think that conversation, BRI works with a lot of teachers around the country, and we often work with social studies coordinators. And you do see a lot of districts and boards and administrations right now basically veto, like saying you are not allowed to express your opinions in class. And I think there is a role for us as a community at different levels to say, I understand your fear, to really empathize with that concern. There's a lot of fear. And I think that we have an opportunity to say, yeah, but for the preservation of our democracy, it's really important that we have these conversations. The reason that it's so scary right now is because we aren't practiced.
Right.
We don't have habits of being in dialogue with people with diverse viewpoints. And that habit, that practice has to start somewhere. And where better than to start in a social studies classroom?
And, you know, to be fair to the principals, I mean, if I was a principal maybe and I didn't have a social studies background, I might do the same thing because it's a knee-jerk reaction, right? To say, well, it's easier to have no controversy whatsoever than to manage controversy, right? And, you know, managing controversy requires leadership. It requires school leadership. And, you know, there's a article coming out in Theory and Research in Social Education. I just accepted it, and it's a great article. And it talks about how, you know, to really do civic education, it's got to start from the top down, right? And they looked at high schools where, you know, high schools in New York State that really looked at how this was being done well. And it starts with an overall community vision, started by the administration of, we value, you know, pluralism and being able to talk about different issues with respect and things like that. So to me, the worst thing that could happen is what's been happening, you know, over the past 5 years or so, ever since, you know, the Trump campaign in particular, of this knee-jerk reaction of saying we can't talk about anything in schools. That doesn't do anything for the future of democracy, as we've kind of said.
And I'm seeing in the comments that people are really interested in this conversation. Can you, like, this is like off the cuff, so if you need a minute to think about it, can you like give a little bit of a crib sheet of people who would be interested in gathering the arguments for the democratic mission of schooling, basically? Where can they turn? Like you mentioned Diana Hess already. We have, you know, Gutman, right? She literally wrote the book. What are some other kind of resources that teachers could go to gather? Because I really do think it's just a knowledge gap. That educators understand things implicitly about the importance of dialogue and these kinds of pedagogical frameworks for education, right? Where can teachers go to learn more about the civic mission of schools and specifically what those civic skills are that are required so that they have that data to go to their administration with.
Yeah, a great organization to me that jumps off my, because I mean I can sit here and just read scholar. I mean, I know there's tons of scholars that do civic education research, but as far as like free materials that teachers can access, the acronym is CIRCLE, the Center for Information
it's at
and Research.
Tufts.
Yeah, at Tufts University.
Circle at Tufts. If you just type CIRCLE at Tufts, then you'll go to CIRCLE. Yeah.
I mean, it's research based. I mean, they talk about what are good civic education strategies that, I mean, right there you can find great ammunition to be able to take to your principals or school boards and say, this is why it's important. That's not the only thing, because like I said, there's tons of scholars in the field.
Well, I actually think the term civic mission of schools come from that report, which has the 6 proven practices as well. So if you're looking for like a justification for some of your pedagogical practices, whether that's discussion or inquiry or those sorts of things, there's a great document called the Civic Missions of Schools, I think. Is that what that's what it was called. But if you look up 6 proven practices for civic education, they actually expanded it to 10 a couple of years ago. But if you just find that document, I thought that was a really great like starting point because it talks about like how each of these classroom activities supports democratic principles and self-governance.
And going back to the previous question, one of the things I tell my pre-service teachers is invite your principal in, have them come sit in and watch, because especially if they're not a social studies, they don't have a social studies background, they might think that you're doing the indoctrination or you're going to get in a shouting match. But if they can see what you're doing and you're engaging in committed impartiality and it's a lively but tolerant discussion, they're more likely to back you up. And the teachers have a role here too. Just like anything else, a principal should be able to walk into your classroom, pull you out, and you should be able to justify what you're doing in the classroom, right? And so I think that's important for teachers to have a solid justification rather than, unfortunately, a lot of teachers come in and go, hey, y'all, what do you think about this? What do you think about abortion, right? If you frame it like that, it's like throwing gasoline on a fire, right? It's like things are going to explode. So as long as if you can come in and justify your pedagogy and, frame it, in a way that gets at that committed impartiality approach, that balanced approach where you're looking at multiple viewpoints, again, on open issues, not settled issues, you're not debating slavery or anything like that. But and let your principal come in and watch, and they'll be impressed.
That openness, that transparency is always, again, it's a lot of fear. It's a lot of fear from a lot of different stakeholders, right? That the administration is afraid for the teachers, but also afraid about parent backlash. The school boards are afraid for their own children, but also afraid for the public communications aspect. There's just a lot of fear, and that transparency really helps open up what's happening in the classrooms, right? And so one of the things the Bill of Rights Institute offers is a lot of primary source work that you can do in the classroom to have these conversations. So I was wondering, what is your take on the use of primary sources to kind of help moderate maybe some of the conversations that happen around politics?
Yeah, sure. Primary sources are important no matter what social studies you're teaching, but we typically think of them in history classes and stuff. So one way is for perspective and to give context. So like, you turn on the news on any given channel and they'll likely say, we're more divided than ever in this country, right? And it sounds good. I mean, we are. There's no doubt about that. We're divided.
There was this election in 1800.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. If you know history, it provides some sort of context. And there's tons of primary source material that you can show students that shows that, like, there's stuff that like Andrew Jackson said about his opponents.
This is the worst that presidents have ever treated each other. You're like, well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, some of the stuff that like Jefferson and Adams said to each other makes a Trump tweet look pretty benign. So context, right? Also, like when you're teaching history, the idea of teaching history and relating it back to present day. So like you're teaching the Spanish flu, right? Show them pictures of people wearing masks. and just that kind of shows that mask wearing isn't some weird conspiracy by Anthony Fauci to, cover people's faces, right? It's been a mitigating factor for disease way back when. And so when they can see, because the Spanish flu is probably the best example that we can have to compare to what's going on now, but to be able to compare, like, same thing about, lessons learned in Vietnam. If you're teaching Vietnam and don't relate it to what's going on now in Afghanistan, that's social studies malpractice, right? It's no good. I also think we can use primary sources to kind of help understand the political world we live in and also predict the political world we live in. James Loewen, who was the famous writer of Lies My Teacher Told Me, and of course many of you probably noticed he died over the weekend. He had been sick for a while, but he passed away. In one of his other books, he has this great lesson that I incorporate in my classroom, where he looks at electoral college maps starting after the Civil War up to present day. And his point in this is, we might say that we're a United States of America, but really we've always been a country of regions, right? The political parties have changed, the names of the political parties have changed, what the political parties, Democrats and Republicans, have stood for have changed, but the regions haven't. And so if you look at, you do a comparison of electoral college maps over time, the South tends to vote one way, the coast tend to vote another way, the middle of the country votes another way. And I always like to bring it back to the 2016 election, where I was one of those people who was shocked when Trump won, because all the polling was suggesting that Hillary Clinton was going to win and win big. And I remember reading Nate Silver, who did the 538, and right on the eve of the election, he said, and they had dropped their percentage for Clinton to win from like 90% to 78%. So they're still predicting it, but it wasn't as strong. And they said, if one of those blue wall states falls, you can expect all three of them to fall, because they have the same demographic. It's very similar, and that's exactly what happened. And then, of course, in 2020, one of the reasons Biden won is because all those three of those blue wall states flipped back, right? And so, again, we're a country of regions, and I think being able to look at that through history is a great example of how it helps us better understand our present. And then the last thing is just the skills that are involved in analyzing primary sources hopefully should help students better equip themselves to understand misinformation online, political misinformation online. So I don't know if any of the folks on this call have looked at the Stanford History Education Group and their Civic Online.
We love Sheg. Sheg is great.
Yeah. And so, if you haven't had a chance to check that out, they do a great job. There's a chapter by Sam Weinberg and his group in the fake news book that Rachel mentioned at the beginning. Their main findings are students are really bad at discerning information online, right, between real and fraudulent information. And two, the best ways that you can improve your skills are basically the same skills that we use for historical thinking, right? Corroborations, and sourcing and stuff like that. And they have done research to show how professional fact checkers do their work. And instead of just trying to, analyze one web page or one claim, they open up bunches of different windows, and they're able to corroborate different resources across the political spectrum. So that's a great way to model the skills that we need to be able to, unfortunately, in this age of fake news and fraudulent information, which is going to get harder and harder as the technology improves. And so
the deep fakes and the websites and everything else is just going to get harder and harder for adults to figure out what's real and what isn't, let alone people whose literal visual perception isn't fully formed yet.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you have a new book coming out this at the end of the year. And what's that topic again?
It's an edited volume, and it's called Post-Pandemic Social Studies. So the argument here is, and of course I know we're still in the midst of the pandemic, but hopefully it'll end at some point. But the argument here is that the pandemic has illuminated so many things about society, especially U.S. society, and it really should make us rethink some of the concepts that we take for granted in socialized education, like, for example, federalism. This whole idea of local control versus state control versus federal control has been on display prominently in the pandemic, and it hasn't always gone very well, right? And so, a lot of times we have these terms in social studies that have been looked at uncritically. And I think the pandemic has shown a light on some of these things that we need to look at more critically.
Absolutely. And so I'm excited to see that come out. We did have one question
Mhm.
come in the chat that I wanted to touch on, because I do think that this is something that is, especially for middle school teachers. So I taught 7th, 8th, and 9th grade mostly throughout my career. And I absolutely know that especially my 7th and 8th, my 8th and 9th graders can talk about just about any topic that adults can talk about. Their question is, how can you help your fellow educators, this is Annalise in our chat, understand the importance of teaching controversial issues and events that they may feel are too much for kids of a particular age? So how do we, there is such a thing as developmentally appropriate content, right? Like that exists. That said, children are, I'm a Montessori educated person, a Montessori teacher, so I have my Montessori teaching credential, but she says at one point that children are the forgotten citizens, right? They are part of the fabric of our society, but we don't involve them often in these kinds of conversations. What are your thoughts or suggestions for teachers to help who know the power and capacity of young people, to help them know how important those conversations are for those young people?
Well, the first thing I would say is that there's research out there that shows that students can do this in elementary school, right? I can again listen to some scholars, Jen Halver, Kathy Bickmore. They have done research to show that students can handle, elementary students, young students can handle these really, heavy topics. Again, the key here is scaffolding, right? Hillary Conklin at DePaul University is probably what I would consider the leading, voice in middle grades education and social studies. And she has a great, I'm actually using it in class tonight, it's my middle school methods class tonight. She has a great article that's in social education from 2010, 2011. And to me, it's a must read for middle grades education, because it addresses that exact question of, middle grades is that weird, 3-year, they're not quite, high school students, but they're not babies anymore. The argument here is, just like you said, they can handle it. You have to scaffold it though, because, and I would even argue that 6th graders are different than 8th graders, right? And so
very different. It's a weird
gap in that 3-year period. So 6th graders tend to be more on the elementary side, 8th graders tend to be more, ready for that high school experience. But you can have the conversations. It just has to be scaffolded.
And it's about finding those resources that do that well, right? So for me, Newsella is fantastic, but I actually don't love where they change the wording, but I would rather just cut to a smaller section, right? So if you're doing a newspaper article, you give them only a paragraph instead of trying to understand the whole article, right? Or you talk about it conceptually by outlining the article for them. And kind of someone was asking, what was the name of the middle grade scholar who paper you're reading?
Yeah, Hillary Conklin, Conklin, and she's at DePaul University
in Illinois.
Yes.
Yeah, which is great. So that's a fantastic resource. Well, we are coming up on our 50 minutes, which is pretty
quick. Yeah,
I know. Well, it's an easy topic to keep talking about, especially these days. But is there anything else, any kind of words of wisdom or things that we didn't cover that you wanted to kind of talk about today in this session?
The only thing we don't have time to delve into it too much, but this idea of the open versus settled.
Sure.
Because a lot of times teachers, I think, when they get in trouble is when they teach a settled issue as open. Like I said, especially in history class, we're going to have, there were issues that were open at the time. Like obviously slavery at one point was an open issue. Women's suffrage was an open issue. Those are not open issues anymore, right? And so I think teachers sometimes are well-meaning. They want to try to engage in these discussions of controversial or taboo issues, but that's the one that's going to get you on the news, is when you start trying to have students empathize with a slaveholder or something along those lines. That's a no-go, right? So the problem is, the tricky part is, there's no one way to determine whether an issue is open or settled. There's multiple ways, and if we had more time, I could go run through those. But You know, you can, there's an article, I saw somebody post something from Phi Delta Kappan, but
I put
yeah,
Diana's article about open versus settled on there for you.
You can put my article on there too, because it came out earlier this year, and it's a very condensed, short, easy to read, that talks about the need to be able to distinguish between open and settled issues. So I'd encourage everybody to read that.
Wonderful. Well, like I said, it has been a rousing conversation. There literally was no one else I wanted to have this conversation with. And where can we reach out to you? What would be the easiest way for people to follow or get in touch or buy your book?
By all means, send me an email. It's awjourne@uncg.edu.
Awesome. And you can follow Dr. Journell. He sells all of his books at all of the places. And I wish we did have more time for this conversation, but we also want to respect everybody's time. It is a busy time of the year, as most is, but we would love to continue the conversation. So if you have any questions or want to submit anything, Dr. Journell has graciously given his email address, and BRI is always here to help. So if there's ever a piece of content or a topic that you're struggling with and we have resources for it, we would love to help co-create those with you. But thank you for being here tonight. This was Civic Conversations, a webinar series from the Bill of Rights Institute. My guest was Dr. Wayne Journell. Thank you so much, Dr. Journell. This was a fabulous conversation, and we look forward to many more. Take care of yourselves. Civic education is hard work, but you're doing amazing work, and BRI is here to help you along the way. So thank you so much, and we look forward to hearing from you next time.
Yeah, thank you.